America is a nation built on laws, its constitution, its courts, its promise of equal justice for all its citizens. But for nearly a century, another power operated in the shadows. It was a secret society with its own laws, its own courts, its own brutal form of justice. This hidden government grew within the bustling cities of a developing nation, a parallel state that thrived on fear, silence, and corruption. It called itself La Cosa Nostra, our thing. To the outside world, it was known simply as the Mafia. This is the story of how it rose from the desperate slums of the late 19th century to become one of the most powerful and feared criminal organizations in modern history. This is the story of a clash between two systems of power, one sworn to uphold the law and one built to break it. To understand the origins of the American Mafia, one must first understand the world from which it came. In the late 1800s, southern Italy and Sicily were lands of deep poverty, feudal oppression, and profound distrust of the state. For centuries, the people had learned to rely on their own networks, powerful local patrons, and a code of honor that valued silence and self-reliance above all. The official government was seen as a foreign predatory force. When millions of Sicilians and southern Italians emigrated to the United States between 1880 and 1920, they brought this deep-seated suspicion and their cultural norms with them to their new home. They arrived in cities like New York, New Orleans, and Chicago, seeking opportunity but finding hardship. Crowded into impoverished ethnic enclaves known as Little Italies, they faced discrimination, language barriers, and economic exploitation. The official systems of American justice and law enforcement were often indifferent, or worse, hostile. In these dense, isolated tenement neighborhoods, the community turned inward. They formed mutual aid societies to provide support, but this environment of isolation also created a vacuum. Into this vacuum stepped men who offered a different kind of order and a more immediate form of justice, for a price. This was the era of the Black Hand, or La Mano Nera. It was not a single organization, but a method of extortion. Anonymous letters marked with a crude black handprint would arrive at the doors of Italian merchants and families. The letters demanded money under threat of violence, under threat of kidnapping, or under threat of destruction of property. These threats were terrifyingly effective because the perpetrators were part of the same community. They knew who had money, who was vulnerable, and who was unlikely to go to the police. This practice was a brutal, primitive form of the protection rackets that would later become a cornerstone of mafia operations. This initial phase was crucial in establishing the blueprint for organized crime. It preyed on the community's fear and its alienation from mainstream American society. It demonstrated that a parallel system of power could operate successfully right under the nose of the authorities, as long as it was contained within the immigrant world. The Black Hand was the seed from which a more structured and ambitious criminal enterprise would grow. It conditioned a generation to understand that in the tough new world of America, power did not always come from a ballot box or a police badge. Sometimes it came from the barrel of a gun and a promise of protection. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect, and the nation officially went dry. The Volstead Act, the federal law outlining the enforcement of prohibition, banned the production, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors. For its proponents in the temperance movement, it was the culmination of a century of activism, a noble experiment intended to cure society of the evils of alcohol, reduce crime, and strengthen families. They envisioned a cleaner, more virtuous America, free from the corrupting influence of the saloon. The reality, however, would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation of human nature and a spectacular failure of public policy. The law had an immediate and predictable effect. It did not stop people from drinking, it simply drove the entire alcohol industry underground. The demand for beer, wine, and spirits remained as strong as ever, and an enormous black market instantly sprang into existence to meet that demand. Millions of ordinary Americans who had never broken a law in their lives suddenly became criminals, brewing bathtub gin in their homes, visiting a clandestine speakeasy, or buying a bottle from a neighborhood bootlegger. This widespread flouting of the law created a pervasive culture of hypocrisy and eroded public respect for the authorities tasked with its enforcement. This new reality created the single greatest opportunity in the history of American organized crime. The gangsters who had been running neighborhood rackets now had a chance to control a nationwide commodity with limitless demand. They already possessed the necessary skills, experience with smuggling, established networks for distribution, a willingness to use violence to eliminate competition, and a deep understanding of how to corrupt police and politicians. Prohibition did not create organized crime, but it provided the capital to transform it from a collection of localized gangs into a series of sophisticated, wealthy, and powerful national syndicates. The noble experiment was about to become their gold rush. The scale of the potential profits was astronomical, dwarfing the income from gambling, extortion, and prostitution combined. A shipment of illegal whiskey could generate more revenue in one night than a year's worth of protection rackets. This flood of new money would change everything. It would fund the purchase of fleets of trucks and boats, the construction of breweries and distilleries, and the arming of private armies with the latest weaponry, including the Thompson submachine gun. Most importantly, it would allow the crime syndicates to bribe officials at every level of government, creating a shield of impunity that allowed their empires to flourish in plain sight. The conflict that Luciano and his allies saw as so destructive was the Castellamarese War, a bloody power struggle that engulfed the New York Mafia between 1930 and 1931. The war pitted the city's two most powerful Sicilian bosses against each other. On one side was Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, the reigning boss of bosses, a traditionalist who had inherited the mantle of the old Morello family. On the other side was Salvatore Maranzano, a charismatic learned arrival from Castellammare del Golfo. He saw himself as a classical scholar and a military strategist, and he refused to pay tribute to the unrefined Masseria. The war was a brutal, drawn-out affair, with dozens of gangsters killed on both sides. It was rooted in old-world rivalries and personal ambition. Maranzano rallied a powerful faction of immigrants from his hometown, like Joseph Bonanno and Stefano Magaddino, who felt Masseria's regime was greedy and oppressive. Masseria saw Maranzano as an upstart challenger to his authority. The war paralyzed the New York underworld, with gangsters forced to choose sides and the streets a battleground for tit-for-tat assassinations. Lucky Luciano and his faction were in a precarious position, nominally aligned with Masseria, but secretly despising both old-school leaders. They saw the war as pointless and a costly distraction from making money. Masseria's paranoia and greed grew as the war dragged on, and Luciano realized his life was in danger from an increasingly erratic boss. He saw the only way to end it and secure his future was to eliminate one of the principals. His pragmatic, business-minded approach led to a fateful decision. Luciano decided to betray his own boss. He secretly contacted Salvatore Maranzano and struck a deal. He would arrange Joe Masseria's assassination, and in return his faction would gain powerful positions under Maranzano. It was a cold, calculated business decision, devoid of old-world loyalty and honor. For Luciano, loyalty was a commodity, and Masseria had become a liability. On April 15, 1931, the first phase of Luciano's plan was executed with ruthless precision. He lured Joe Masseria to a lunch at the Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant on Coney Island. After the meal, Luciano excused himself to go to the restroom. As he did, a team of assassins, believed to be Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis, burst into the restaurant and opened fire, killing Masseria in a hail of bullets. The famous apocryphal image of Masseria lying dead on the floor, an ace of spades clutched in his hand, symbolized the end of an era. With his death, The Castellamarese War was over, and Salvatore Maranzano was the undisputed victor. Maranzano rewarded Luciano for his betrayal. He called a grand meeting of the Sicilian gangs in New York to declare victory and outline his vision for the American mafia. At a Bronx hall, Maranzano declared himself the capo di tutti I capi, boss of all bosses. He lectured the assembled gangsters on the Roman legions. He reorganized New York into a system of 5 families and designated bosses. He established a clear hierarchy and set of rules. Luciano and his allies realized they'd traded one old-world tyrant for another. Maranzano was as greedy and power-hungry as Masseria. His Roman emperor vision clashed with Luciano's cooperative corporate idea. Maranzano's suspicion of non-Sicilians, especially Luciano's Jewish associates like Meyer Lansky, created tension. It became clear Maranzano saw Luciano as a future threat. Word reached Luciano that Maranzano had marked him and Vito Genovese for death. Luciano knew he had to act first. He had not eliminated one Mustache Pete, only to be ruled by another. Just 5 months later, on September 10th, 1931, Luciano put the final phase into action. He hired 4 Jewish assassins provided by Meyer Lansky, unknown to Maranzano's bodyguards. Disguised as police officers, they gained entry to Maranzano's Manhattan office, where they shot and stabbed the boss of all bosses to death. With this single, audacious act, Lucky Luciano had eliminated the old-world leaders and cleared the stage for his radical reorganization of the American mafia. He could have easily declared himself the new capo di tutti I capi, but Luciano had a far more radical and modern vision. He understood that the concept of a single, all-powerful dictator was inherently unstable. It bred resentment, encouraged betrayal, and led to the kind of destructive wars he had just helped to end. He believed that the future of organized crime lay not in dictatorship, but in cooperation and corporate governance. To implement this vision, Luciano abolished the title of boss of all bosses. He declared that from now on, all the family bosses would be equals. He retained the 5 family structure that Maranzano had established in New York: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese, but he fundamentally changed the power dynamic between them. To govern this new arrangement, he proposed the creation of a ruling council, a body that would become the most significant innovation in the history of American organized crime, the Commission. Following the radical reorganization of the 1930s, the American mafia entered what could be considered its golden age. For roughly a quarter of a century, from the end of Prohibition until the late 1950s, La Cosa Nostra operated with a remarkable degree of invisibility and impunity. With the Commission providing a stable national governance structure, the bloody and public gang wars of the past became a distant memory. The organization turned its focus inward, quietly consolidating its power and expanding its influence into the very fabric of the American economy. The new generation of bosses, led by figures like Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Carlo Gambino, preferred the boardroom to the battlefield, operating from the shadows as masters of a vast, hidden empire. This era was defined by a pervasive and convenient public denial of the mafia's very existence. Most famously, J. Edgar Hoover, the powerful and long-serving director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, steadfastly maintained that there was no such thing as a national crime syndicate. He focused his agency's resources on pursuing bank robbers and hunting communists, largely ignoring the systemic corruption being orchestrated by organized crime. This official denial, whether born of ignorance, political calculation, or a simple lack of viable strategy, created a perfect environment for the mafia to flourish. Nowhere was the mafia's mid-century power more absolute than on the docks of the East Coast, particularly the sprawling port of New York. Control of the waterfront was a cornerstone of their empire, perfected into a science of corruption and extortion. The International Longshoremen's Association was completely dominated by La Cosa Nostra. Bosses like Albert Anastasia ruled the Brooklyn docks as his personal fiefdom. He was known as the Lord High Executioner of Murder, Inc., and his control over the Union was total and terrifying. Through their control of the ILA, the Mafia dictated every aspect of waterfront life. They determined who got to work through a corrupt system of hiring bosses who demanded kickbacks. They controlled loading and unloading, allowing them to pilfer goods with impunity, a practice known as skimming. This power was leveraged during World War II. After the suspicious sinking of the SS Normandy in New York Harbor, U.S. naval intelligence grew concerned about Axis sabotage on the docks. In a controversial secret agreement codenamed Operation Underworld, the government enlisted the help of the imprisoned Lucky Luciano. In exchange for his cooperation, Luciano was promised consideration for parole, a promise that was eventually kept when he was deported to Italy after the war. This episode starkly illustrated the depth of the Mafia's power. They had become so entrenched in a vital piece of national infrastructure that the federal government, in a time of war, felt it necessary to negotiate with them as if they were a sovereign entity. In the mid-20th century, the American Mafia embarked on its most audacious and visionary project, a gambling paradise in the Nevada desert. Las Vegas was to be their Monte Carlo, a glittering oasis built with illicit money and underworld expertise, the ultimate money-laundering machine. Bugsy Siegel led the initial development. His grand vision, the Flamingo Hotel, a luxury casino meant to set a new standard. The project ran massively over budget and was plagued by Siegel's mismanagement, angering his mob backers. Siegel was murdered in 1947, likely on orders from impatient investors, but his Vegas vision endured. Their financing model was corrupt genius. They controlled unions, especially the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, to get massive, often unsecured loans. They were building Las Vegas with truckers' retirement money. Once casinos opened, their real genius was the skim. Controlling counting rooms, they siphoned untaxed cash before official counts and regulators saw it. The entire sprawling empire of La Cosa Nostra, from the docks of New York to the casinos of Las Vegas, was protected by a single, powerful principle: omerta. This was the unwritten, unbreakable code of silence. This code of silence was reinforced by the Mafia's initiation ritual. A prospective made man was brought before the family's boss and captains. In secret, his finger was pricked, a drop of blood smeared on a holy card, often of a saint. The card was set aflame in his cupped hands, and as it burned, he swore an oath. For decades, the wall of silence proved almost completely effective. Police could arrest low-level bookies and enforcers, but could not penetrate the upper ranks. They had no inside sources, no wiretaps, and no star witnesses to explain the command structure or link bosses to crimes. As long as omerta held, leaders remained untouchable, protected by soldiers who would rather die than talk. It seemed the society would remain secret forever, its inner workings a mystery to the law. On November 14, 1957, the Mafia's carefully constructed cloak of invisibility was accidentally and irrevocably torn. Over 100 of the most powerful mob bosses from across the United States and Italy gathered for a grand summit at the secluded country estate of a mid-level boss, Joseph "Joe the Barber" Barbara, in the sleepy rural town of Appalachian, New York. The meeting was called to resolve a series of pressing national issues, including the division of the rackets left vacant by the recent murder of Albert Anastasia and the ongoing power struggles within the family of the ambitious Vito Genovese. A curious state trooper named Edgar Croswell noticed the unusual number of expensive out-of-state cars descending on the remote Barbara estate. Suspicious, he called for backup. Soon, a small army of state and federal law enforcement officers had set up roadblocks and surrounded the property. When the mobsters inside realized they had been discovered, panic erupted. The portly, well-dressed dons, men who hadn't run in decades, fled in chaos, trying to escape through the surrounding woods and fields. their expensive suits and shoes ruined by the mud and brambles. It was a scene of pure farce. The police rounded up over 60 of the fleeing gangsters. Among those captured were some of the biggest names in the American underworld: Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Joe Profaci, and Stefano Magaddino. The true damage of the Appalachian raid was not legal, but psychological and public. The incident was a massive public relations disaster for the mafia. It made headlines across the country, providing the first concrete, undeniable proof of the existence of a national coordinated crime syndicate. Most importantly, it made J. Edgar Hoover and the federal government look foolish. Their long-standing denial of the mafia's existence was now utterly indefensible. The secret was out, and the pressure to finally do something about it was immense. In response, the U.S. Senate formed a special committee to investigate the connection between organized crime and labor unions. The committee, which began its work in 1957, became famously known by the name of its chairman, Senator John L. McClellan of Arkansas. Its chief counsel was a young, ambitious, and aggressive lawyer named Robert F. Kennedy. The McClellan hearings, which were televised live, became a national sensation. For the first time, the American public was given a front-row seat to the inner workings of the mob's influence. The committee subpoenaed over 1,500 witnesses, including high-ranking mob bosses, corrupt union officials like Jimmy Hoffa, and terrified owners of small businesses who had been victimized by mob extortion. Robert Kennedy, in particular, became a national figure, relentlessly grilling mobsters who appeared before the committee. The mob bosses who were forced to testify, like Sam Giancana of Chicago and Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, provided a masterclass in defiance and obstruction. They consistently invoked their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, refusing to answer hundreds of questions. The federal government now had the political will to fight the mafia, but they still lacked the crucial inside intelligence to dismantle it. That all changed in 1962. A low-level soldier in the Genovese crime family named Joseph Valachi, who was serving a prison sentence for drug trafficking, came to believe that his own boss, Vito Genovese, had marked him for death. Terrified for his life, Valachi panicked and beat another inmate to death, mistakenly believing him to be a mob assassin. Facing a murder charge and certain death at the hands of the mob, Valachi made an unprecedented decision. To save his own life, he decided to break the sacred code of omerta. He reached out to the FBI and offered to tell them everything he knew about the secret society he had been a part of for over 30 years. In October 1963, Valachi testified in televised public hearings before Senator McClellan's committee. His testimony was a bombshell that captivated the nation. He described the initiation ceremony. He outlined the hierarchical structure of the families. He named the current bosses of the 5 families of New York, and revealed the existence of the national ruling body, the Commission. He revealed that the members of this secret society called their organization La Cosa Nostra, which translates literally to our thing. Armed with this new name and the structural blueprint provided by Valachi, federal law enforcement agencies, under the direction of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, began to systematically build their intelligence files. Agents began to develop informants, cultivate sources, and, for the first time, use court-authorized electronic surveillance. However, prosecutors quickly discovered that the existing laws were inadequate for the task of dismantling such a deeply entrenched criminal organization. The bosses gave the orders, but they rarely got their hands dirty, making it nearly impossible to link them directly to the crimes under traditional conspiracy laws. This frustration led legal scholars and prosecutors to search for a new weapon. The breakthrough came in 1970 with the passage of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, more famously known as the Rico Act. Its core purpose was to make it a federal crime to belong to or operate an enterprise that was engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity. The law also carried severe penalties, including long prison sentences of up to 20 years per count, and crucially, the forfeiture of all assets and profits derived from the criminal enterprise. This asset seizure provision was perhaps Rico's most devastating component. It gave the government the power to bankrupt the mafia. The Rico Act was not the final chapter in this story, but it was the turning point that marked the end of the beginning. It signaled a fundamental shift in the balance of power between the state and the syndicate.